Hi there! In this video I will give you an introduction to Final Fantasy XIV and hopefully make your first few hours in the game as easy as possible. I've played this game for way too much time and I have some valuable tips, so despite this video being pretty long, I think by the end of it you'll have learned something worthwhile. Additionally, the video is time-stamped, so if there's anything that you find particularly obvious and want to skip, you can just skip to the next section that you find interesting. Let's get started with a brief introduction of what this game actually is. What's important to understand is that the Final Fantasy XIV that we have today is not the Final Fantasy XIV that was initially released. The first version of this game that was released was, to put it mildly, not very well received, leading to the studio completely reworking it. To achieve this lore-wise, this bald man right here teleported the player characters 5 years into the future, when the world of Eorzea, and consequently the Final Fantasy XIV Metacritic score, had recovered. And that's where you as the player start off, in Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. What makes this game special in my opinion is the very heavy story focus. I have never played an MMORPG with a story as good as Final Fantasy XIV. So one of the most important tips in my opinion is to take your time with the game and experience the story, because if you rush to the end game, you might get disappointed. If you haven't played the game yet and maybe not even installed it yet, do note that Final Fantasy XIV has a free trial up to the second expansion, that being Stormblood, which was recently expanded from the first expansion, Heavensward. That alone is hundreds of hours of content and should give you a good idea of what to expect. Beyond that, the game has a very standard monetization. You have to buy the most recent expansion, then you have to pay the monthly sub fee, which is 11 euros. And on top of that, there is a cosmetic item store, which is not inside the game, but outside the game in your browser. There are no items that are going to give you any in-game advantage. It's really all just mounts and glamour. Once you're in game, you're going to be faced with character creation. And here I'm going to walk you through your different options and also give you some recommendations for starting classes. For the races, your options are the Hyur, Elezen, Lalafell, Miqo'te, Rogadin, Aura, Hrothgar, and Viera. It doesn't matter what you pick here because it has no impact on gameplay or your starting zone, so you can just go with whatever you feel like. However, do note that Hrothgar and Viera are both very limited in their choice of hats. I know this might be a weird detail, but this could be important for some of you. This is because they were added to the game later, and I don't think they were initially even planning on adding any extra races. So there's obviously some coding challenges here, and they were unable to make all the hats available for these two races. If you're ever unhappy with what you picked, when you reach a certain quest around the level 50 mark, you're going to get a free Fantasia, which is also an item that you can get in the store. This lets you completely redesign your character to your heart's content. When you've picked a race, you're also going to get a choice of a clan. So for example, for the Hyur, we can pick between Midlander and Highlander. And you're going to see starting attributes on the left side. Now, honestly, I don't know why this is still in the game, but the stats here are so minuscule that they're going to have no impact on your gameplay at all. So again, just go with whatever you want to play. Next up, you're going to have to select a class. Now this choice is less important than you might think, because in Final Fantasy XIV, every character can play every one of the classes simultaneously. We're going to get back into that later on, but just know for now that no matter what you pick, if you're unhappy with it, you're going to be able to level up another class on this same character in a fairly short amount of time. Right now, it's also important to understand the differences between classes and jobs. Classes are what you see on screen right now. All of these classes at level 30 turn into jobs. So what you see right now might not be what you're going to get whenever you level up more. Think of it as kind of a promotion. Not all jobs that are available in the game start off as classes, however. Some of the jobs just start off as jobs beyond level 30, which is why the selection might seem a little bit limited right now. Gladiator turns into a paladin, which is a tank that uses a sword and a shield. This is your classic sword and board tank that will primarily take a beating for the party and keep everyone else safe. Tanking does come with a little bit of added responsibility, but the game does a great job of introducing you to the mechanics, so if you feel like tanking, don't hesitate to start off on a tank. Pugilist turns into monk, and this is all about beating up people with your fists. In my opinion, in terms of its rotation, this is one of the more unusual jobs, However, a lot of people really enjoy it. Marauder uses a two-handed axe and turns into Warrior, which is a tank just like Paladin. Warrior has a bit more of a focus on healing themselves. Lancer uses a spear and turns into Dragoon. This is one of the most significant changes of any of the classes, because once you turn into a Dragoon, you turn into a dragon-slaying badass that spends more time in the air than actually on the ground. I think it's a very fun melee job that is suited to beginners because you can just press all the buttons that come up and you're going to do fine. Archer uses a bow and turns into Bard. Bards have a strong focus on buffing their party and they use different songs to achieve that, as well as a combination of other party-wide utility. So this is a more supportive choice, but you're still a damage dealer. As for the Disciples of Magic, Conjurer turns into a job called White Mage. When I first started playing the game, I thought Conjurer would be what summons different kinds of creatures. And so instead of starting as a DPS, I actually started off as a healer. White Mage itself uses different high potency heals to keep the party alive and well. And this is definitely the easier of the two healer options that you have right now. So if you're interested in healing, give Conjurer a try. Thaumaturge turns into a job called Black Mage. And this is possibly the most difficult job in the game to actually master. However, the basic rotation isn't actually that difficult. What makes it difficult is the high-end optimization. That's because Thaumaturge is the closest to what most people would expect a mage to be. You're casting high damage spells, they have long cast times, and unless you have an intimate understanding of the job, it's going to be hard to keep up damaging the bosses while also running around. The job also feels very different from other jobs while leveling, so just be prepared for a bit of a challenge. Lastly, we have Arcanist. This class uses a book, and it's actually the only class that turns into two jobs at the same time, those being Summoner as well as Scholar. Summoner is a very straightforward magical range damage dealer, and possibly my top pick for players just starting off. The rotation is very straightforward and has a nice progression. It allows you to move around a lot more than Black Mage, and I think the overall theme for it is just really well done. Scholar, on the other hand, is another healer. And in this case, it's a so-called barrier healer, or shield healer as people like to call it. That's because unlike White Mage, it doesn't focus on burst healing as much as slow and steady healing over time, in combination with being able to summon barriers, as well as using mitigation to block or mitigate incoming damage. So for tanks, I would recommend you go with Marauder, which turns into Warrior, which is possibly the easiest tank. For DPS, I'm going to recommend Arcanist turning into Summoner, and for the healers, I would highly recommend Conjurer turning into White Mage. Depending on the choice you make, your starting zone is also going to change. However, very early on in the game, you're going to visit all of these starting zones anyways. Next, the game is going to ask you to select a world. This is important to understand if you want to play with your friends. If you click Select Another World, you're going to see which data center you're on. And below that, you're going to see all the worlds within that data center. Changing your data center for the character select screen is only possible inside the main menu. However, you can select any world that you want out of the list inside of the data center that you see right now. I would highly recommend starting off on one of the preferred worlds, which are going to be marked with a little star. That's because you're going to get massive XP bonuses that are going to be really worth it in the long run. Traveling between worlds in a data center is possible in-game, while traveling between data centers is only possible whenever your character is logged out. Whenever you're not on your home world, however, you're not going to have access to all of the game's features, such as accessing your retainers, which we'll talk about later on, and additionally you're also not able to join a free company, or FC, which is this game's version of a guild, because you can only join an FC that is located on your home world. Once you get into the game, you may be tempted to change a bunch of settings, but for your first few hours, I would actually recommend sticking with the default. There are only two things that I would change. First of all, we need to adapt the keybinds that you're using if you're playing on keyboard and mouse. That's because the default control scheme only really supports clicking spells. I've made a very short video on how to sort out your keyboard layout, which I'll link below, which you can watch whenever you feel ready. The other thing that I would highly recommend changing is the hotbars. By default, you only have access to 2 hotbars, and ideally we want to add another one. The easiest way to do that is to go to System and HUD Layout. This will give you an overview over all the UI elements. What you're going to want to find is hotbar 3, which you will then right click, and then you can move all 3 hotbars that you have enabled so they're aligned. and don't take up half of your screen. After that, you can save your changes, and that's pretty much all you need to do for now. I have a bunch of videos that focus on changing settings for the game, which I will again link below, and you can go through them if you feel like it. But that's something that I would put off until later on when you understand what these changes are actually doing. Now let's talk about your journey to max level and what you will encounter along the way. Firstly, and most importantly, we need to talk about different kinds of quests that are available and which ones you should do and which ones you should just avoid. The first quest that you're going to get is a side quest, which is actually a little bit misleading because this is the only non-optional side quest you're ever going to do. Outside of this, the quests marked by this marker usually mean that the quest is optional and gives you a small amount of XP and gil, which is the in-game currency. Sometimes you can get other small rewards, but most of the time these quests aren't really worth doing. The quests that you should focus on for now are the main story quests, and these are marked like this, and they will also appear on the top left side of your screen in the scenario guide. The main story quests, or MSQ as people call it, will take you all the way from your current level to the highest level available. The experience points that you get from this and any other duties that you have to do along the way will be more than enough to get you to the highest level, and actually beyond that, so it could be a good idea to pick up another job so you're not wasting any experience points. Other quests available are these blue quests, or feature quests as they're called officially. Completing these will generally unlock new game features. This is also how you're going to unlock the different jobs in the game. Also note that not all feature quests are going to be available to you immediately. Some of them require you to reach a certain level or a certain point of story progression, so it can be worth checking your map every now and then, even in regions that you've already been in. Another type of quest that is technically a feature quest, but important enough to highlight here, is the job quests. Job quests are a job-specific quest line that you're going to be doing up until a certain level. These will not just unlock new abilities, but also turn your class into a job at level 30, so it's very important that you keep up with these. You can see whether you have a job quest available for the job that you're playing right now by looking below the scenario guide. You can click on that quest and it will tell you where you need to go. Again, I can't stress how important these are. I would actually prioritize them over doing your MSQ. Next up, let's talk all about gear, items, and your inventory. As you go through the game, you will get different kinds of items thrown at you. Some of them by default will land in your inventory, and some of them will land in your armory. Gear will by default land inside of your armory. Your inventory and your armory are completely separate. You can store gear inside of your armory, but also inside of your inventory, but you can't store regular items inside of your armory. Just think of it as kind of a special gear storage. For now, I'm going to recommend that all of your gear keeps landing inside of the armory, but do note that there is a setting that you can change so all of your new gear lands inside of your inventory instead, which can make managing whatever new items you get a little bit easier. One thing that's really useful about having items inside of your armory by default is the recommended gear button. When you open your character screen, you can click this button right here to automatically equip the gear that is best suited to your character that is currently inside of your armory chest. So whenever you get a new item and you're not sure if it's worth equipping, just press the recommended gear button and you'll find out. If you ever get overwhelmed with the amount of items in your inventory and it's a whole mess, you can right click on an item and sort them. And then if you're unhappy with how the game sorted the items, you can right click again and select undo sort. When you hover an item, you can find out different things about it. For example, if it can be sold from a vendor, it's going to give you a shop selling price. You're also able to see whether the item that you have is tradable or not. When it comes to gear, there are a lot more stats and a lot more than I want to cover in this video. However, there's one thing that you want to look out for, and that is condition. Over time, the condition of your gear will go down and you will have to repair it. This can be done at a lot of vendors throughout the main city, so just keep your eyes open. Early on, this is unlikely to be a big problem because you're going to be replacing gear at a faster rate than the condition is going to go down. As you explore the game further, you're going to stumble over these crystals called Aetherytes. They come in two varieties, those being the Ethernet shards inside their capital cities, as well as the big Aetherytes that are strewn all across the game world. When you see these Aetherytes, you want to make sure that you attune to them, which is like unlocking a teleport point. Not only can you teleport to Aetherytes, however, but you also have different options available when you click on the main Aetheryte of a capital city. First of all, you can click on the Ethernet, which will allow you to teleport to any of the small Aetherytes around the city. Next, you're able to visit other worlds on your data center, which can later be useful because the markets on each of these worlds is completely separate, so you can travel to another world and possibly buy an item for cheaper. Next up, you can set a home point, which will allow you to return to that specific Aetheryte. Additionally, you can place favored destinations, which will allow you to travel to whatever places you go to a lot for a cheaper price. So whenever you reach a new zone that you're going to be leveling in a lot, don't forget to attune to the Aetheryte and also set it as a favored location. As you play the game more, you might ask yourself how you can sell items to other players, and this is done through the Marketboard. Again, you can find these in all of the capital cities, and they will give you access to all of the items that other people are selling from their retainers. Retainers are unlocked fairly early on by simply following the main story, at which point you will talk to a retainer advocate and be able to create your retainers. Retainers can do various different things, but the most important function that they have is being able to store items and also sell items for the player on the Marketboard. Unlike many other MMORPGs, if you want to sell anything, you don't go directly to the Marketboard and put the item up, but you give the item to your retainer and tell them what price you want to sell it for, and they will sell it for you. Retainers can also level up through completing ventures. To complete ventures, however, they need a currency of the same name, which you can get in many different places throughout the game. I don't want to go into too much detail here because it's not exactly relevant to the story progression, and free trial players actually don't even have access to retainers at all. What is important to note, however, before you create your first retainer, is that your retainer's level is restricted by the level of your character on that same job. So if you're a level 50 summoner, then your retainer can also at most be a level 50 summoner. Depending on the job of your retainer, they're going to have access to different ventures. Overall, I think that having one combat job and one disciple of the hand or land as a retainer is a good mix. Next up, I want to talk about crafting and gathering. In 14, this is done through the use of disciples of the land or hand, which are jobs just like all of the combat jobs we looked at previously. That means you unlock them in much the same way as the combat jobs we looked at previously, but you're going to level them in a different way. Whenever you want to get into this system, I have a video about gatherers and crafters and the best way to level them as you go. Just like combat jobs, all of the crafters and gatherers have their own abilities. However, once you figure out how to craft on one job, the other ones are going to function exactly the same as the abilities are identical. For the three gatherers, it's slightly different. Botanist and miner have the same abilities, however with different names, and fisher has a completely separate set of abilities. Very early on in the game, I would actually advise against starting a crafter or gatherer. The returns you can get in the early zones just aren't very good unless you know specifically what you have to look for, which beginners aren't going to know. A lot of the methods that you're going to use to level aren't even available to you yet, and on top of all this, you do have to sink a bit of gil into it. So beginner players without any knowledge of Final Fantasy XIV's economy are more likely to lose gil than to make gil with these jobs. My advice is that you should at least get past Heavensward and maybe even Stormblood before you consider getting one of these. Also remember that in the free trial you don't have access to retainers, so you can't even sell whatever you're going to craft. And additionally, you won't really have a lot of space in your inventory to store all of the crafting materials. Of course, you can disregard this advice and see how it plays, but don't say I didn't warn you. Lastly, for the more economical side of the game, before we move on to more combat-focused topics, I want to talk about the companies in this game, namely Grand Companies and Free Companies. The Grand Companies are located in the major city hubs, those being Ul'dah, Limsa-Lominsa, and Gridania. And they are called the Immortal Flames, the Maelstrom, as well as the Order of the Twin Adder respectively. Throughout your main story, you're going to stumble over them and you will have to make a choice between one of them. For the most part, the Grand Companies all offer the same benefits. There are different types of quote-unquote missions that you can complete, the most important of those being the supply and provisioning missions as well as the expert delivery missions. One of these can be used as a good source of XP for leveling your crafters and gatherers, and the other one is a great way of turning on any excess gear that you're going to stumble on in return for a currency called seals. These seals again can be spent at the Grand Company vendor. Most of the rewards are identical, but there is some Grand Company themed gear, and there are also different mounts depending on which of these Grand Companies you choose. If you ever feel like you regret your choice, or you want to collect the other rewards for other grand companies, you can simply change your allegiance for a small fee. For the start, however, just go with whichever one you prefer. Free companies, on the other hand, are basically guilds from other MMORPGs. Joining an FC early on can be a good idea because they offer different kinds of buffs. Which buff they use is up to the FC leaders, but popular choices include higher XP from slaying mobs, reduced teleportation cost, and also lower durability wear. By joining an FC that has a house, you can also buy an apartment inside of that house that you can then decorate. However, apartments are also available in the big apartment buildings inside of all of the housing zones. If you want to find yourself an FC, I highly recommend you make use of the community finder, which I'll link below. And I would highly encourage you to find one early on, because this game is a lot more fun when played with others. Next, let's move on to some combat basics here. I'm going to keep it very simple, and I might even oversimplify a few things, but this is just to get you on the road. The abilities that you see on your hotbar are called actions in Final Fantasy XIV. Actions are separated in different types of actions. Those being weapon skills or spells, which are kind of the same category just with different names, as well as abilities. The difference between weapon skills and spells to abilities is that weapon skills and spells will put other weapon skills and spells on cooldown, while other abilities don't put anything else on cooldown. If you're familiar with the term global cooldown from other MMORPGs, that's basically it. So your goal in combat, to put quite simply, is to always use weapon skills or spells back to back. In between those, while the cooldown is running, you can then weave all of your abilities. You can check what type of action you're looking at by hovering over it. So whenever you get a new action added to your toolkit, have a quick look at what it does, what type of action it is, and whether you're meant to use it between other abilities, or if it puts other abilities on the global cooldown. This is very different from other MMORPGs, where very often you have downtime between pressing abilities. In Final Fantasy XIV, you're very much always pressing abilities. You should minimize the amount of time where you're not casting anything, where nothing's on cooldown. This might take a few hours to really get, but you'll know what I mean soon enough. Next up, we have role actions. The role actions available to you obviously depend on your role. Tanks have their own role actions. Healers have their role actions, however DPS have different sets of role action depending on the type of DPS. So melee DPS, physical ranged, and magical ranged all have their own set of role actions. You can find all of these role actions inside this tab, and they're going to unlock over time. As far as the usage goes, there's no difference to the rest of your actions. Just add them regularly to your hotbar, and just try and make use of them whenever appropriate. When you use your rotation, sometimes you will notice that abilities will light up. This is called a proc. Most commonly, this is used in combos, for example. A lot of jobs have a very basic 1-2-3 combo that then often branches off. Warrior, for example, casts Heavy Swing, then Maim, then Storm's Path, or Storm's Eye. And when these abilities are cast in that order, you gain bonus damage. Sometimes procs don't indicate combo abilities, however, but simply the ability becoming available. So while it's easy to just press anything that lights up, often it's more complicated than that. So just like with the previous tip, make sure you read the proc ability and understand why it just came up. Let's focus on the different roles for a moment and what they do inside of a party. If you've played similar games, this is going to come quite naturally to you. Tanks have the ability to turn on a so-called tank stance, which lets them generate something called enmity, which, to explain simply, is just a measure of how much the mobs that you're fighting hate you. Whoever the mobs hate the most, they're going to attack. So the tank's job is to run around and make everyone as angry as possible at them, so they can soak the damage for the party and not one of the other jobs. To deal with all of that, they have extra mitigation abilities, which allow them to reduce incoming damage, but they generally deal a little bit less damage. Healers, on the other hand, focus on, obviously, healing the party and making sure nobody dies. Right now there are two different types of healers in the game, those being pure healers and barrier healers. The pure healers are White Mage and Astrologian, whereas the barrier healers are Sage and Scholar. The pure healers generally have some higher potency heals, and the barrier healers generally have lower potency heals, but they make up for it with the extra ability of providing damage mitigation and barriers. I like to think of it more as a difference of burst healing versus slow healing over time, and ideally you want one of each of these inside of your party. That's not really going to be relevant until you're making your own parties later on in the game, however, because for now you don't really have a choice of who you get queued with. However, it can be useful to understand what the other healer is good at or not. DPS, on the other hand, are separated into 3 categories: physical ranged, magical ranged, and melee DPS. In general, there are more selfish jobs and more selfless jobs, with the selfish jobs mostly providing damage, while the more selfless jobs provide a little bit less damage in return for more party utility. What party utility they have can vary. For example, Summoner and Red Mage can revive players inside of their party, while the other caster, being Black Mage, doesn't really have any group utility at all. Another quirk that's good to know is that melee DPS have to land so-called positionals, meaning they're going to be moving around the boss to deal optimal damage. However, this is more of a concern for later on. Lastly, for the basic combat tips, I want to talk about buffs and debuffs. By default, your buffs will be shown right here, and your debuffs right here. One thing that I would recommend everyone is to move the debuffs to a location where you can see them more easily, and then increase the size of the UI element. That's because a lot of mechanics, at least later on, will rely on you seeing debuffs very quickly, and so having them crammed at the top of the screen doesn't really help. As far as the buffs go, you can leave them up there, or do it as I did and just move them right above your hotbars. Something else that's worth noting here is that some of these debuffs can be dispelled by healers with an ability called Esuna. The ones that can be dispelled will have a blue bar above them, which you'll be able to see inside of the party list, so healers should have a look out for those. It helps reading whatever you're about to dispel just to understand what it is, because some of them are actually not worth dispelling, like minor poison damage. In a lot of cases you'd rather keep damaging the boss because it's so insignificant. Next up, I want to talk about player versus player content and how to get into it. In general, to get into PvP, you're going to need to reach level 30 and then complete a quest for your Grand Company. There's a special PvP zone called the Wolf's Den Pier, which you will also unlock. And this is actually a great place to go early on because you can set up your PvP hotbars. That's because your PvP abilities are completely separate from your regular abilities. A lot of them share names, but don't be deceived, they generally do something completely different. You can find these PvP specific actions by going into your PvP menu. And from here, just like regular abilities, you can drag them to your hotbar. The currencies you get from participating in PvP can be exchanged for various rewards, but they won't provide any player power, meaning you can't get any gear like you can in some other games. Next up, let's talk about gearing from 1 to 90, specifically for all of your combat jobs. Generally, you'll get plenty of gear from your main story and also from the dungeons that you're going to complete. So inside dungeons, you want to make sure that you need roll on items that are upgrades for you. Up until level 50, if all of that is not enough and you find yourself falling behind in levels on one of your gear pieces, it can be an okay idea to buy one from a vendor, but do keep in mind that the vendors that you'll find over the world are generally fairly expensive. So I would avoid buying gear from vendors unless you really have to. Starting with completion of the MSQ up to level 50, you're going to have access to a currency called Tomestones of Poetics. These can be exchanged at various vendors that you're going to find over the world, always in an expansion specific hub that is not the main city, for the best gear that you're going to be able to find for that level range. So at level 50, you should aim to get a full Poetics Tomestone set. When completing the story up to level 60, another vendor is going to become available, and so on. These vendors exist because they previously provided players with endgame items. Even in the current expansion, max level players are using another Tomestone type to buy gear, but whenever we move on to the next expansion, these gear pieces are instead available for Poetics. Poetics can be gained through many different ways, but one of them is simply doing all of the duties. So as you run dungeons and trials while leveling, you're automatically going to get Poetics. An additional source of Poetics is doing the daily duty roulettes. The duties listed here will provide a daily bonus upon completion, and a lot of the time you also get extra tomestones. So if you want to save up tomestones, consider running a few daily roulettes, maybe even on an alt job that you want to level on the side. And this can actually be a really good way to make some decent gil early on too, because the leveling roulette, for example, will give you 12,000 gil for being an adventurer in need, meaning that specific role is in need. So if you want to make some gil on the side and also level up an alt character, consider picking up a tank or a healer, or maybe even both, depending on whatever is needed. 12,000 gil in endgame terms is not a lot, but it's going to be one of the more consistent sources of gil that you'll have early on. And some of the more chronically broke players are really going to need it so they don't end up stuck with no gil to teleport around. Once you reach level 90, there are different sources of gear. One of them is, for example, the normal raids. There are different types of tomestones that you're also going to get through roulettes. There's gear that you can get for completing savage raids, different upgrade items. You'll find out soon enough. To complete the whole gear section, I want to talk about glamours. Glamour is the word that players use to refer to changing the appearance of your items. So if you're running around in an ugly armor right now, fear not, because eventually you'll be able to change that. I will link the quest that you need to complete to get access to this system down in the video description. Once you've done that, you have access to the Glamour dresser, which you can use to store items, which you can then use to apply their look to other items. Once you unlock it, the system is pretty self-explanatory. You can also link glamour sets to different gear sets that you have. Gear sets are basically combinations of gear on your job. Now the most common use of this is switching between the different jobs that you have. Because remember, to switch jobs, you just need to switch the weapon. Very early on, this is actually not available to you, but once you unlock it, you can save your gear set by clicking this button right here, and then change to another gear set in this list. If you want to have easy access to the gear set, you can also grab it and put it on a hotbar, for example. If you right click it, you can then link it to one of your glamour sets. And that's it for the gear. Lastly, I want to talk about the overall experience a little bit and some general advice that I have after spending way too much time on this game. First of all, the game does have a very slow start, meaning the early main story stuff isn't really super interesting, but it really ramps up over time. It took me a while to warm up to the Final Fantasy XIV story, and when you compare it to other media, it's perhaps not top of the line, but it's really good, especially for an MMORPG. What I was most impressed with was the quality of the trials and dungeons as time went on. I recommend you give the game some time and reach at least Heavensward if you're not digging the early story, as the whole Empire arc, in my opinion, is kind of dragged out and not really that interesting in the first place. The quality of the voice acting also goes up dramatically later on, and the game is just more polished as a whole. In addition to that, Final Fantasy XIV is kind of notorious for having a slow start in its abilities as well, meaning it takes a long time for your jobs to actually make sense. So that just kind of adds on to the early drag of the game. Now I hope you have a lot of fun in the game, and I've prepared you well for your first few hours. Hopefully I've made it slightly less daunting, and if there's anything else that you want to know, there's a good chance that I have a video about it on my channel. Now if you haven't set up your controls yet, I highly recommend you watch this video right here, which will run you through the keyboard and mouse settings. Or if you've already done that, I would highly recommend you watch the combat video, where I teach you some more advanced tips that are going to start you off on the right foot. For now, I hope I'll see you in the next one. Peace.